Please make sure that please make sure that you keep yourself muted. If you have questions, we can have you put those in the chat. So down at the bottom of your screen, just hit that little chat bubble and type it in there. Joshua will help keep an eye on that for us, and we'll try to get all those questions answered at the end of the presentation. Likewise, if you turn your video off, that'll likely help with the lag time if you're having any on the streaming side of things, and kind of help to keep the presentation moving along smoothly. So with that, we'll turn it over to Brittany. If you want to share your presentation, and we will get to learn all about family forest carbon.
All right. Everyone see the slides? All right.
Looks good.
Thank you. So my name is Brittany. I should mention before I start that I used to be a peer of Josh at the Conservation District up here in Presque County. I was the County Conservation District Forester for FAP up here for about 8 years before I came to the before I left the Conservation District to come to AFF. And it was a lot of fun and worked with Josh and very much enjoyed that. So my background before I came to AFF about 2.5 years ago was with the Conservation District. But I've loved being with this program and I'm excited to share it with you, and looking forward to your questions at the end. So just to give you a sense for what we're going to cover, I'll give a general high-level overview of the program, and then I'll talk about the specific eligibility as it relates to the Midwest, what you can do as a landowner to explore enrollment, and then there'll be a Q&A and sort of some next steps to prime you for where you might go to explore it if you'd like to check it out for your property. So the Family Forest Carbon Program is co-run by both the American Forest Foundation, who is my employer, and the Nature Conservancy. And these two nonprofits worked together to develop this program and started offering it back in 2020, beginning in the Appalachian region, specifically Pennsylvania, West Virginia is where we first started, to create a new opportunity for landowners. So for some background and context, this type of thing, carbon markets, in the past was limited more to landowners that had a large amount of ownership. And when I say large, I mean 2, 3, 4, 5,000 acres plus were the only landowners that really had access to this type of market for their woods prior to us and now some of our other competitors that offer small landowner carbon program offerings for say 30, 40, 50 acres, et cetera. Before it was specific to very large ownerships. And the reason for that is because it's very expensive to do the carbon accounting part of it. So I'll get into details a little bit later, but to count the actual carbon on the land is expensive. It takes a lot of staff time and resources to set up plots and to do that. So by these two nonprofits working together, we were able to create a methodology or rule book that made sense for smaller landowners and create this opportunity for folks with as little as 30 acres. And we've been rolling now for about 4 or 5 years in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy. So 39% of forests nationally are owned privately. In Michigan, it's even higher. I believe it's around 60 or 61% of our forests in the state of Michigan are owned privately. So there's a lot of private land out there, a lot of landowners that are looking for opportunities to take care of, manage their land, et cetera, learn about what they might try. And this program was created to, give a new opportunity and capitalize on that for landowners that, like I said, might not have had access to that before, just those larger, more corporate ownerships typically. And this program is designed to sort of provide economic stimulus for landowners, for their local communities, and spill some money into rural communities. And our program, FFCP Family Forest Carbon Program, is funded. Since we are a nonprofit, we have access to federal funds. The Inflation Reduction Act spilled a little bit of money into our hands so that we could, provide it to landowners as incentive payments for doing this program. We work with some philanthropic donations and private donors as well. So the Family Forest Carbon Program in a nutshell is a carbon program for landowners with as little as 30 acres and sometimes slightly smaller depending on circumstances to play in this market for 20 years. So our contract length for landowners is 20 years. And all landowners have to have a forest management plan, much like the Qualified Forest Program, which I know you're familiar with. Different kind of program, but similar in that we both require forest management plans, and this program provides extra income, forestry guidance, and is designed to, of course, store and sequester carbon, but really create opportunities to improve forest health, wildlife habitat, carbon storage, and that sort of thing. So each landowner property is different. Each goal for the property is different, but this program is designed to help enhance what landowners are already doing and provide a little extra income to help them do that. So I'd mentioned this before, but this program is unique, and a few of our competitors do a similar sort of thing, but we're unique in that we're providing a new market opportunity for landowners that previously were not able to access it. Larger acreages were all that could play in this space before. So now we're able to provide something for smaller landowners that give these guaranteed annual payments. And we're unique in that we pay not for the carbon itself, but we're paying for what we call a behavior change or a harvest modification. We're unique in that we allow landowners to harvest throughout the contract length. There is a harvest allowance in addition to the carbon storage that we're focusing on. And some of our competitors don't do that. If you think about carbon storage and sequestration, you might think, no harvest at all, but we do have an allowance for that, which is unique. And the annual payments are in exchange for harvest behavior change, essentially, and not necessarily quantified carbon storage. And the payments, we've figured a degree of market valuation change into the future price of this market. It is emerging, and there's a bit of uncertainty, but we did build some of that into the payments to anticipate future increases. And of course, we are assuming the negative market fluctuation. It is a flat rate payment. So you sign a contract for 20 years, you get a flat rate, and the ups and the downs are built into that flat rate. So whether it goes really up, you wouldn't necessarily immediately capture that up. But then if the market has a fluctuation down, you'd be protected or buffered against those negative market fluctuations. And I'll get into payment specifics a little bit later in the presentation as well. And I should mention, so the voluntary carbon market is the space that we play in. There's two major carbon markets, and just for a little bit of background, I should provide this context. So there's the compliance market, which is like government mandated emissions reductions. It's not a thing here in Michigan, but out west, you might hear like the California cap and trade market, where it's a whole different sort of thing, but that's like a mandated emissions pathway where states are required to follow a certain pathway for emissions reductions. But the voluntary carbon market is, as the name implies, voluntary. Businesses, landowners, everybody that participates voluntarily, and there's not like an overarching body that's setting regulations or deciding how things go. Each registry is how these guidelines are governed. So our registry is called VERA. So think of a registry, if you have no background on the carbon markets at all, you can think of a registry like a storefront. Like they choose, so we're a developer. So a registry will decide which developers' methodologies or rule books that they like, and then offer that on their storefront. So to put that in a sentence, VERA says, FFCP, we like your methodology, so we're going to offer that on our shelves for people to explore and see if it's a good fit for them. To get a methodology approved is a big deal. Methodology is a heavy science rule book on how to do the carbon accounting, how to set up the projects. I like to call it the rules of engagement, really. That's what a methodology is. And Vera liked ours, and we started offering our methodology through their registry in 2022. So an approved methodology means that we can fully operate as a developer and have our carbon credits flow through the whole process. So getting into the next section will be about benefits to landowners at a high level. And then after that, I'll get into the specifics of eligibility criteria. So I'd mentioned this before, but these annual payments are guaranteed. You can use them for anything. It comes as a check annually in exchange for participation over the course of 20 years. A lot of times, like with other programs, landowners might use it for property taxes or, improvements to the property or what have you. But really that money is for you to use as you would decide to use it. And we don't retain any like timber rights, or we don't, take any ownership of the property aside from the carbon rights. So that is recorded in the deed. It's an encumbrance in the deed, and we retain the carbon rights, just the carbon rights, for 20 years. And that gives us permission to do monitoring. So a subset of landowners in our program are selected for monitoring. And I'd mentioned early in the presentation, the expensive part of why very large landowners were the only ones to play in this space. The monitoring part is the key. That's where we're actually going out, seeing the growth over time, seeing the diameter and height growth, et cetera, and actually monitoring those changes, quantifying those changes. And that's how we're getting at how much carbon is stored on the landscape. And I didn't mention this before, and I don't actually believe I included a slide on this, so I'll just say it about our methodology. So we use what's called a dynamic baseline. So that's the reason that landowners can utilize this market, our market opportunity, without paying a bunch of money, because we spread it out over landowners across a region. A dynamic baseline is matched against forest inventory and analysis data, which is it's a giant Forest Service data set that serves as like our control group, right? So that's the data set that exists out in the world in absentia of a carbon program. So that's just tracking what's happening naturally in the landscape, regular market fluctuations with timber and whatever's happening, maybe with forest health, say oak wilt, for example. Those things are captured in the FIA data set. And we compare a group of landowners in our program against that FIA data. It's called an aggregate comparison. And because all landowners are aggregated, we're not really tracking carbon on any one property. Aggregated monitoring compared to aggregated control group means that it's not expensive for the monitoring portion. And that's why, as little as 30 acres can access this market. And we are unique. Our dynamic baseline, that control group comparison over time using a real-time data set, is unique. Most of our competitors in this space use a projected baseline, not a dynamic baseline. So projected would be sort of a projection of future potential conditions based on data that we have, that we extrapolate out and say we think XYZ is going to happen over a set amount of time. So another benefit is we do provide all landowners, because we require a forest management plan. We require that for all of our landowners. We provide a stipend for all enrolled landowners. Once you sign a contract with us for 20 years, we give you a flat rate extra check to have a forest management plan developed or updated. So if you already have an FMP and it expires, say, 5 years into our contract, that's when you would get the stipend. So it's based on when your FMP expires, or if you don't have one, you get an additional payment in year one to have one developed. And you do have up to 2 years to develop that post signing of contract. So you're not in a rush to develop one, but we do give choice as well as to who you want to work with. I will say there's a lot of consulting foresters in Michigan that work with us. We do contract with consulting foresters to do part of our work and help their clients and other interested landowners move through this process. So if you have a consulting forester that you like, one that you've worked with for a long time, and you want to maintain that relationship, that's awesome. We'd love to work with your consulting forester if you'd like to work with them throughout this process as well. And FMP, Forest Management Plan, we don't have a lot of strict rules on what that contains. So like a Qualified Forest Program plan, a Forest Stewardship Plan, an NRCS plan, there's a lot of different management plan options out there for landowners, and we don't have strict requirements as to what that contains. So there's a lot of flexibility as to the type of management plan that you can choose to use for the program. And of course, this is an ongoing relationship. We don't sign a contract with you and say, see you later, see you in 20 years. We do have connections. We have quarterly chats with our enrolled landowners, and we have a community engagement team, a sustained community engagement team that works with landowners that are current enrollees. So you'll always have somebody at our company to help if you have any questions or concerns or what have you. So you're sort of joining a group of landowners, and both that community of landowners that have chosen to walk this road, but also you have a lot of support internally from our company. So I'd mentioned this before, but we have these quarterly chats with our group of enrolled landowners. And so you have an option to really connect with those folks. And we have lots of opportunities for you to gather potentially with other landowners. And we're starting to get into those sorts of things. So just joining a connected group of landowners that are doing the right thing, much like Tree Farm. I should mention, probably many of you are familiar with the American Tree Farm system, which we do own. The American Forest Foundation administers the American Tree Farm system. So that community of landowners, it's really sort of a similar thing that we're shooting for, is to connect like-minded individuals on the back end. And of course, these connections, this income, hopefully enhancing rural communities all over the US. So next, I'll talk about the eligibility portion, really kind of the meat of what we're looking for when we develop a carbon project on any given property. So as of today, we have about 850 thereabouts landowners enrolled across our coverage area, and that includes from Minnesota down to Alabama up through Maine. So we're not out west yet, but we are through most of the eastern seaboard, and that amounts to about 120,000 acres. And of those landowners, those properties, we've committed about 30 million in payments to landowners over the 20 years of their aggregate contracts. And we do survey landowners, and so far, about 90% of enrolled landowners say they are highly satisfied so far with the program. And as for states, I'd mentioned our coverage, but these are the states specifically where we do operate the Family Forest Carbon Program. There is plans to expand at some point. I can't speak to that specifically right now, but we have expanded quite a bit in the last 2 years. So if you have land in these states and would like to explore it in a different region, or have friends or neighbors or family members that you think might be a good fit in these states, just reach out and we'd be happy to explore those too. Each region has different eligibility, so I'll cover the Midwest eligibility here, but the Northeast and the Appalachian region have slightly different eligibility criteria than we do because it is forest type based. I mentioned before about the living control group data set that we use. Of course, the forest types are different across the country, so the control group criteria must vary based on what we call an ecoregion. So ecoregion is kind of an overarching area of the country where soil types, cover types, et cetera, are all similar enough that we can declare, like we'll draw a circle around a certain area and say this ecoregion needs this criteria. So that's kind of how we operate. So that's why these are broken down the way they are, is because these groups of states mirror similar ecoregion trends. So I'd mentioned a little bit before, but our program is also unique in that we sort of are designed to work in conjunction with a harvest plan. Obviously not like harvest all the time, because that would defeat the core purpose of the program, but there is an amount of harvest allowance that landowners get in our contracted period. And because of that reason, because we have harvest allowance and we are compatible with QFP, generally speaking, a lot of our landowners that have currently enrolled or that are interested in enrolling, that are in the pipeline, have forest management plans, are in QFP, are actively harvesting and doing those sorts of things. So we have a pathway for that. We do have an expectation that landowners would harvest. So many of those landowners find us and they find it's a good fit to work in conjunction with what they're already doing. I'm sure many of you hunt, many of you use your land recreationally. That's the types of folks that are coming to our doorstep, and of course, thinking about legacy planning and that sort of thing. 20 years is a long time for contract. So, considering what the family needs might be in the long term, and if this is a good fit, that seems to math out pretty well for a lot of our landowners, our enrollees. So 30 forested acres is the minimum that we're looking for. I'd said before, some exceptions for maybe a little bit less acreage for certain landowner if the goals are right, if the forest types are right. But generally speaking, we're looking for a 30-acre project. And of course, that property cannot have restrictions on timber harvesting. That would hurt what we call in the carbon world additionality. So additionality is the idea that what we're doing with the program is creating an additional carbon benefit to the landscape. So, if your property has, say, a conservation easement that fully restricts any commercial harvesting, we wouldn't consider that for enrollment because, we can't make a good faith claim that we're doing an additional benefit because that easement already has that land protected from intensive harvesting or over harvesting, et cetera, et cetera. So we can't make a good faith claim if you are not allowing harvesting on the land. It's pretty uncommon to see that, but we always do our due diligence and check. So if you come through the pipeline, we'll certainly review any easements that you have for the property. And of course, same situation for additionality. If you've tried NCX, NCX is, we do have a pathway for that. Previously, we weren't able to enroll landowners that had done NCX. We now do have a pathway, but for all other carbon programs really that I'm aware of at this moment, if you tried one of those, you can't join our program because of the double dipping risk. We can't mathematically or in good faith figure out where one carbon credit ends and the next begins, so to speak. So NCX, we were able to work out a pathway, but if you've done any other carbon programs, we can't enroll as of right now in FFCP. So at a glance, so I mentioned a lot of these things before, but just to reiterate, our contract is 20 years and landowners have the option at the beginning of the contract period or throughout, you can decide to automatically re-enroll at the end of 20 years. So we have a clause where at the end of your 20-year contract, you can immediately re-enroll. And obviously, we've only been around for about 4 or 5 years, not 20 or 40, but I would imagine that would continue. If you did 20 years, you could do another 20 and another 20 and so on. But we'll cross that bridge in the future. But for now, at the end of 20 years, you can decide to re-enroll if you would like. 30 forested minimum acres. And we are looking for a certain level of stocking. So 80 square foot of merchantable timber is the forestry stocking metric that we look at here in the Midwest. Basically, what that means is if you have a bunch of seedlings, very, very small trees, a brand new forest that's only been growing for a few years, we can't enroll that. And the reason for that is because of the additionality claim and what I'd mentioned before about harvesting. And a forest that's 5 or 10 years old isn't under any pressure, so to speak, for harvesting. There's no merchantable economic, there's no reason to get in and cut a forest that is so young. So we can't really make an additionality claim. There needs to be merchantability at the beginning of enrollment. And we've decided, based on the modeling and the information we've looked at in this region, that 80 square foot is our minimum that we can accept for merchantability, or where, a logger, a forester, a landowner might decide, okay, that's enough stocking that I might consider a timber harvest. And for cover type, there's FIA considers like an overarching cover type. So maple, beech, birch is like we call it an FIA forest group type, and oak hickory is a group type. But really on the landscape, and what that means is at least 50% of a given project's basal area or trees standing density of the trees is comprised of these forest group types. So that might look like traditional northern hardwoods, typically like sugar maple dominated or red maple, some yellow birch, white birch, American beech, things like that. And I have, Josh may have covered at some point in his seminars what a dichotomous key is, but we have a key for typing out these different species. And there's more species than I've listed just now to comprise maple, beech, birch. But generally, if you hear northern hardwoods or know that you have northern hardwoods, it's probably eligible. And same with oak hickory. We say oak hickory because that's the governing FIA forest group type umbrella, but we don't really have very many hickory in our ecoregion, the Northwoods, the area that we operate FFCP in the Midwest. So it's really oak, red oak primarily. White oak also falls into that group. And again, there's a few other species I haven't mentioned here if you look at a key, and we would type that out for you, but really kind of oak dominated or maple dominated is generally speaking what we're looking for. At least 50% of the basal area in a given area for a contract would comprise those species. And of course, because it's a carbon program and the goal is carbon sequestration and storage, clear cutting specifically is not allowed. Not that clear cutting would be a common silvicultural practice in these cover types, but we don't allow for that. And high grading, of course, I'm sure you've heard about that as a concept, but high grading is taking the biggest and leaving the rest. And we don't allow for that. We do have a harvest allowance, like I'd mentioned, and part of that involves not reducing the quadratic mean diameter past a certain percentage. And that harkens to the high grading, which is not to overly remove very, very large trees and focus on very, very large trees when removing. Of course, we allow for sustainable harvesting. It's up to 25% of the standing basal area in a contract area over the course of 20 years. And that can look differently depending on the size of your property, right? 30 acres might have a little different strategy they'd like to cut versus, a 500-acre contract. So the specifics sort of vary based on the size of your property, but 25% is the basal area harvest allowance overall over that 20 years. And we do have a personal use allowance for firewood that is separate from the merchantable harvesting allowance. So you can see the allowance table on the bottom there. It's based on the project area, contract area, if you will. How big your contract area is governs the amount of cords of firewood you can pull off of the property. Live trees standing have a diameter limit before it becomes a commercial harvest, but fallen wood that you pull for firewood does not. So if a very large tree falls naturally in your woods, you wouldn't have to report that, for example. It is an honor system, these 5 cord allowances for landowners, but we do sort of have this ability to, like if, for example, if you wanted to do maybe a small foot trail or footpath or something like that, there's a little bit of give there where you might cut a handful of trees within your allowance to create a footpath. So it's a nice little extra buffer to allow for subsistence, if you pull firewood and use it, or, to give a little wiggle room for certain small tree removals. And I mentioned the FMP. So different foresters in the Midwest have different plan lengths that they typically write. I know some foresters in southern Michigan and in parts of the Upper Peninsula do 10-year plans. A lot do 20. In Wisconsin, some foresters do 25 or 50-year management plans. So it really depends where you're at in the Midwest, but generally what we're looking for is an updated plan every 10 to 20 years. So I mentioned ecoregion. So we are not all throughout our 3 states in the Midwest yet. We don't fully cover Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. We follow, this is our ecoregion line here that you're seeing. So these counties above this line are what we refer to as the North Woods, or the 212 is the number, the ecoregion. So the ecoregion similarities across these 3 states are as such that the practices that we've developed, or what I've just covered with you, the eligibility criteria, we call it a practice. Growing mature forests is the nickname, GMF practice. That applies all throughout the ecoregion. So any of these 3 states can utilize that, and it's a similar enough trend that we've created this practice to apply all throughout the ecoregion. So if you were in northern Minnesota, you'd have the same criteria as northern Michigan. So I mentioned the FMP. So this is what we offer landowners as a stipend. It's not always going to pay for the full cost of a forest management plan. Different foresters charge different things, but it is intended to be a nice chunk of cost share, and it can be paired with other things. It's a check cut to you. Like if you enrolled in year 1 and you didn't have an FMP, it'd be your first payment. And here's an extra, say $800 if you had a 40-acre property. Here you go, please develop an FMP and send it to us when you're done. And the nice thing about these stipends is it's based on forested acreage, not contracted acreage. So for example, if you had 200 acres that you owned and 190 of it was forested, but you only had a 40-acre contract, we would pay you for the amount of forest that you own. So the plan is really intended to cover the whole ownership and not just a contract area. It really wouldn't make sense for a forest management plan to be for a footprint of a contract area. It should be for the whole property, and that's what we're paying you to do, is develop one for the whole property. And I'd mentioned before, we work with several consulting foresters in Michigan that contract with us to offer FFCP project planning services to their clients, or, new landowners that don't work with foresters that are looking for somebody to work with. We can make those connections as well. But if you have a consultant that you like that we don't already work with, let us know and we'll try to connect with them. And if you'd like to work with who you're working with, we can try to make that happen if they are interested in working with us. So I'd mentioned easements before. So conservation easements are pretty common. Most of our enrollees across the country have some sort of easement, whether it be conservation or some kind of right of way or gas line or utility or what have you. There's a lot of different types of easements that I've seen, and the vast majority are compatible, but that's something we'd collect early on. Conservation easements will often set terms for harvesting, some restrictions perhaps, but most of the ones I've seen, especially in Michigan, seem to govern on the same guidelines that we do, which is have a forest management plan, do sustainable harvesting. Many of them will request that the landowner notify the conservation group ahead of time if they're going to do it. So those types of easements are compatible with us, but we'll look at those, we'll collect those. But if there's any sort of restriction whatsoever, we can't proceed due to the lack of a good faith claim. Other areas we might exclude, aside from, if you had like a plantation. So plantations, we don't allow larger than 5 acres. We do have a little bit of wiggle room, I should mention. So our core thing we're looking for, maple, beech, birch, oak, hickory, oak and or maple dominated forests that over 50% or more of the basal area comprises those species. We can roll some other things in, but we have a little bit of wiggle room for projects to also include up to 25 acres of other things. So if you're not quite hitting that 50%, or you've got a really diverse mixed area that's hitting our density requirements, so that density, the 80 square foot, basically the measure of merchantability, is this forest able to be harvested economically, we can roll some of that into our projects now as well. And that would include a little bit of plantation, but once it reaches the 5 acre threshold, we cannot proceed with those. Of course, any maintained area, maybe that goes without saying, but food plots, farm fields, roads, right of ways, gas wells, etc. Anything that's non-forested, we're going to exclude those areas, of course. Buildings, houses, barns, cabins, etc. And I usually recommend to give yourself a little bit of a buffer, when you have these projects developed outside and around. Like if you live on the property and you have a cabin, you might want to give yourself a little wiggle room there as well. Understocked areas, so anything below that 80 square foot, those very young forests, which a tiny shred of that can be rolled in. Those details can be worked out with a forester. You certainly don't need to remember those details, but there's a little wiggle room for a tiny fraction of understocked areas to fall within our projects here or there. If you have future building plans, if you want to build a structure or, change the land use of the property, maybe put in a food plot, something like that, that's something you'll want to work out with us early on. That way we can exclude and really be sure we have the footprint of those future areas mapped out for you. And of course, again, maybe it goes without saying, but ponds, rivers, things like that, any riparian areas, we will carve those out as well. More on the personal use allowance, or I say personal use, firewood allowance. Typically, you might hear it called firewood allowance, but this is your non-reportable thing. You don't have to report to FFCP your 5 cord per year limit. Now, of course, it goes up. If you have a larger project, you have more of a cordage allowance for firewood, but most of our landowners, the vast majority that enroll with us, are in that smaller acreage bucket. So usually we just say 5, but 5 and up from there, you can harvest for personal use. Firewood, if you want to burn it, you can sell it. You can sell that firewood as well, if that's your thing. And I've mentioned the no diameter limit. So if a big tree falls down, naturally, a freshly fallen, larger diameter tree, you can harvest that without reporting it. But if you're harvesting live trees, if they're standing live, and 12 inches and up, we start to kind of get into harvestable, commercial grade harvesting territory. So that's where we're looking at, your harvest allowance. That's where that sort of begins. So substantial harvest, commercial harvest, harvest allowance, all terms to describe our 25% that we allow in 20 years. So you're working with a third party forester, consulting forester, whoever, sometimes an industry forester, if you're working with somebody that's a good fit. But they are the ones who do this harvest for you on behalf of FFCP, really. So this person, what they would do is a pre and post harvest cruise. So this can be a little tiny bit taxing to get done just because it is a detailed cruise that we're looking for. Forestry terms, we're looking for like a 90th, 95th percentile cruise, which means a very exhaustive look at what's standing. And we need that to determine that the harvest that was done was within our specification. So forester goes out, they cruise the property that's going to be harvested, the footprint of the contract area all throughout. Count those trees, get that inventory, and then when the harvest is completed, that's then done again, and then that's reported to FFCP. So we can keep track of that. I will say, so QMD, that's what we say, QMD, quadratic mean diameter, which is kind of the average standing density of the trees. I typically recommend most landowners do this harvest allowance once. Logistically, economically, it kind of pencils out more to do it once in the 20 years. For most landowners, especially on the smaller acreage side, 30, 40, 50, 60 acres, et cetera, for a contract. In the very, very large acreages, there's a little bit more, I think, creativity to be had where you might do multiple installations that sum up to your harvest allowance. It really sort of depends on the property, on the contract, but I find that it just makes a little bit more sense in my experience to have it done one time if you're on the smaller side for a contract. But of course, those sorts of details, if you wanted to check this program out and see if it was a good fit, we could have those conversations property to property once we get a look at what you have and what your goals are and what makes sense for your land. We'd give you maybe some recommendations to help govern what makes the most sense. So last part of the presentation, just a few more slides before our Q&A. I'll talk about how our payments work and next steps if you want to explore this and see if it's a good fit. So 20-year contract, I'd mentioned that a couple times, but bears repeating. So the payment amount is a 1-to-1. So your contract price, your 20-year contract price would be your eligible acres times 200 or 240 if you go our premium route. So we have two different payment options. The next slide, I'll show you how that would break down. But the standard rate is just the standard, the rate, $200 times your contract area. The premium rate's $240 times the contract area, but the premium rate, we are able to pay a little bit more because it's federal money. So we are able to both pay more and also pay more upfront. So landowners get a little bit more of their 20-year contract price earlier in the contract length. Of course, that stipend applies either way, whether you're premium or standard, you're getting an additional stipend based on the size of your forest. And the contract, you obviously have lots of time to review this information before you make a decision. We say 30 days when you receive your offer, but you can extend that. It's just like 30 days, we'll check in, how you feeling? We can extend it another 30 days. We really want you to have time to make a decision that's right for you and really review this with your family and the other decision makers that you have to work with. But on average, across our enrollees, it's about 80 days for most landowners from start to finish to consider this program. So this gives you an example of a payment schedule for each, for the standard and for the premium option. So you can see premium option, it's still 20% of the total contract price in year 1. But when you do the premium option, you get 13% in years 2 and 3. So you're kind of almost getting like 50% of your whole total contract price by the third, fourth year. Whereas with the traditional or standard option, it's paid out a little bit more evenly throughout the 20 years. And the reason that we say premium as well, it's a little bit more payment because it's federal money and because we have a little bit of extra money to spend, but it's also a couple of extra steps on both your end and ours to recoup that money. It's more on us than on you, but all landowners that go the premium route will need a farm and tract number from your FSA office, which isn't terribly difficult to get. It's really it's a number assigned to your property. And that number is so that if you decide to harvest during the 20 years, we as FFCP, AFF will have to come out and do what's called a CPA 52 form, an environmental assessment form. It's a lengthy document where we have to go through and look at your property and note resource concerns and that sort of thing. That only happens if you decide to harvest, but because we have to take that step, it's time consuming. The logistics of it can be a little tricky, and because you have to take some steps, that's why we're giving you an extra 20%. Little bit of a extra headache, I guess. It's not too bad, but in exchange for those steps, you'll get a little extra cash. So this is sort of a flow chart to think about how you might move through the system. Landowners visit our website, and there's a mapping tool where you can highlight your property or properties that you'd like to consider, and then check your eligibility, and it'll spit out a yes or a no initial sort of assessment. We use geospatial data, GIS, various different layers to sort of assess initially whether landowners are eligible. If you get a no, you're not eligible, you can contest that. You can reach out to us and we'll take a second hard look at your property just to be sure we got it right initially. So you can check that out if we did make a mistake. Another thing to note, we do have a multi-owner contract that is pretty new. So if you have like family lands, LLCs that are slightly different ownerships, we can enroll those under one contract. That is a new thing that we do allow. So, keep that in mind when you're selecting. If you have different groups of ownerships that you want to select under different contracts, you might say ownership one, owned by one person, you might select those parcels and move through until you get the report and then revisit the website and do like the next round. If you want to keep them separate, you can do that. So next, after you've submitted your woodland and you are eligible, you would reach out. We would set up an appointment where you talk to someone from our contact center or one of our members of our forestry team to go through. We do some questions just to sort of make sure we're on the same page about documentation, harvest restrictions, that sort of thing. Getting a sense of your ownership history and if you've done any harvesting, what have you. It's a list of questions that we'll go through with you, have a conversation, and we'll get some more information. And then you're connected. If you weren't already connected with a forester, that's when you connect with either one of ours or with a consulting forester to move through a project planning and checking for eligibility. And then once we've done all of our information, we submit a map. And that map gets sent to you. It's called the offer package. And that's where you can say, this looks good to me. This map seems correct. The payment seems worth it. And if you like the offer, from there, you get a contract and you sit with that contract for as long as you need to make a decision. The contract is specific to you. And if you like it and you sign the contract, that then begins the term of your agreement. And you get your first payment and your stipend for the forest management plan. And then you kind of get dialed in with our group of community engagement managers and other landowners. That's our website, familyforestcarbon.org. So I'm sure there'll be a follow-up, but that's where you'd want to go if you want to just see if this is a good fit for you. So we have a couple spots on the website where you can sort of dive around and read some stuff. If you'd rather read up a little bit before you just dive into the mapping eligibility, that's great. We got a lot of spots where you can check that out, how it works, a couple blog posts you might read if you want some more background information. Otherwise, you can move through it. No cost to you. There's no strings attached, unless, of course, you sign a contract. So, pretty risk-free if you think you might be a good fit. So you can also call this number if you don't have a computer, don't really use one. Somebody from our staff can move through that mapping with you at this number. Or you can email us here for some assistance if you need that as well. And that's what I have, really. So I really thank you for coming to the webinar and listening in, and I thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions you might have now.
Thanks, Brittany. So I think we had a couple come into the chat, and Josh, if you want to, we may have worked our way through a couple of those, but do you want to field those and see where we're at?
Yeah, we can do that. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. And then I have a series of questions for you after that, Brittany, that hopefully is beneficial to everybody
You bet.
in this webinar. So Chris asked a couple questions. I think you did kind of answer both of them. The first one is regarding the management plan. It would seem this would require a different plan than those used for other programs based on the desired outcomes, or could one plan serve multiple programs? If not currently enrolled in other programs, would the plan for FFCP be focused solely on carbon storage? So it's really a two-part question.
Okay, so that is a really good question. And the nice thing is that a plan can kind of cover all things unless, like for QFP, you're required to harvest at a certain frequency. And Michigan's a lot less strict than some other states, but for those plans where you have a mandated timeline, that would be the only area where we'd have to look at it. Like, for example, in QFP, if you're in QFP and you have a harvest scheduled, say for 3 years into the contract that would exceed our harvest allowance, in order for that to apply, we'd maybe have to reach out to QFP and potentially amend that or change the harvest schedule. But no, the plan wouldn't need to be carbon storage specific. It can be kind of all encompassing. What we're really looking for is just that a property is looked at by a forester and under the care of a forest management plan. Because you have a plan, you don't have to follow it. It's really just a guidance, a guidebook. And I guess if a landowner is going to enroll in FFCP, we might make some recommendations accordingly. Like obviously you wouldn't, recommend a heavy clear cut or a harvest that's not in line with our harvest specifications. But if you have a plan pre-existing and you're not under any obligations to follow a set harvest schedule, there's no need to make a modification. I don't know if that answers your question, but there is a lot of flexibility there. If you're not under a mandated, follow this to the letter of the law on this time frame at this density sort of situation.
And that would only be for the eligible cover types, correct?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So like if you have a property with a couple hundred acres and you've got, a 40, 50, 60 acre footprint for our program, but you have other acreages that are a wildly different cover type, wildly different silvicultural prescription, you can continue on as you would. What we say is business as usual. There's no harvest modification that needs to happen outside of the contract area. So with those management plans, if there's recommendations for non-contract area that are, different than what we might recommend, they can continue on. There's no obligation under the non-contract parts of the property.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Brittany, but one other slightly way to think about that, and Chris, hopefully this has been helpful, is regardless of what programs you're in, or if you're not in a program at all, if you have maple, beech, birch, or oak dominated forest, you simply need to adhere to the don't take more than 25% out based on commercial harvesting, don't exceed the amount for personal use, and make sure you're within that acceptable deviation for quadratic mean diameter. So it doesn't matter what other programs you're in, you just have to adhere to those requirements if you have those cover types and you want to get carbon payments for those cover types. Is that accurate, Brittany?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And many plans that might apply to something like qualified forest could very well do that. But if your qualified forest plan says that you're going to be cutting heavier in those eligible cover types, then it's not a good fit for the carbon program.
That's right.
And I feel like you already answered Chris's other question, which is how are other cover types considered? And he's got examples here: plantation pine, lowland conifers, if they meet the basal area requirements. I mean, they're not eligible, correct?
So up to 25% can be folded in. If you've got a minimum of 30 acres of the core offering, the maple, beech, birch, oak, hickory, what have you, we can fold in up to 25 acres. The plantation would be the one exception. There's only a little bit of a plantation allowance, but if it's natural red pine, natural white pine, etc., lowland conifers, or a super mixed, highly diverse, scatter. I've seen forests like that too. We can sort of fold those in if they're hitting that 80 square foot of basal areas. We can fold that in and say you were going to have a 30-acre project, you would have a 55-acre project by, extension if you had those other cover types that met that requirement for basal area.
So I have a hypothetical for you, Brittany, and then we had two more questions come up in the chat, and I'll make sure that we address those. But since we're on this topic, it's an example just to sort out eligible acres versus carbon payments. So here's one example, which is somebody has 30 acres, which meets your minimum acreage requirement. 15 acres is aspen, and 15 acres is oak dominated forest. So you've now met the 50% of that 30 acres based on basal area is above 80 square feet per acre. Let's just say that requirement is met. If somebody wanted to enroll that, the carbon payments would only apply to the 15 acres of oak within that 30 acres, or is that not accurate?
So you're saying in this example for the 30 acres, 50% of the basal area across it's like a mixed forest of the two, and 50% of the basal area or more slightly is oak, and then the rest is mixed aspen. That's what you're saying?
Let's say it's not mixed, that it's 30 acres, but 50% of the 30 acres is oak dominated, and there's a hard line between that oak forest and then an additional 15 acres of aspen. The way
Then
the
that wouldn't be
bulletin is
eligible.
that it would be.
It would be?
It would be or it would not be?
No, it
Okay.
wouldn't be. If
So it has
it's
to
a
be
very
mixed.
distinct, yes. So that's
Okay.
kind of if it's for example, like an aspen monoculture, like I've seen in the chat, like or big tooth ash, maybe big tooth aspen is what was meant there, but an aspen monoculture, 15 acres, that probably wouldn't be a good fit just because of the silvicultural recommendations for that cover type. Though depending, there's certain examples where like a mixed oak aspen might apply, depending on the site conditions and then the health of the forest and landowners' goals. But if there was a hard line, then that property wouldn't qualify because it would technically only have 15 eligible acres. If there's only 15 acres of oak and the other 15 is hard line, say aspen in this example.
So the mixed part is key.
It's got to be like in any given plot, like if you're throwing plots, variable radius plots out in the woods, at least half of the standing basal area has to fit within our two overarching forest group types.
Without a hard line between cover types, though.
Yes.
Okay. I think
And the
that
hard
might
line,
be
okay. Go
that
ahead.
might be worth clarifying on the bulletin, because the bulletin says that enroll at least 30 acres of forest land with maple, beech, birch, or oak hickory species making up at least 50% of the basal area. So the example I gave you, one interpretation of that could be that you have 30 acres of forest, period, right? That's all you own.
Right.
And 50% of it is oak, but it's very
Yeah.
distinct from the remaining aspen. I think that's an important distinction to make on the materials going out to landowners.
Yeah,
'cause
that's a
that
good
wasn't
point.
clear to me.
I never thought of that actually. Thanks for bringing that up.
So it should be
I'll
a
make a note of
mixed
that.
cover type, and then you get payments
Yes.
for the entire 30 acres.
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Whatever
Yeah.
your contract area is, what we're contracting with you, that's what you get paid for.
Okay. I have others as well to ask you that hopefully again benefits everybody, but I'm gonna get to these other two in the chat. Are landowners in Tuscola County able to be part of this program?
I don't think Tuscola is in our eligible region right now. It's just south of the ecoregion boundary, I believe. I have to look at a map, but I think it's just south. So right now, that would technically fall in our 222 region, which is the ecoregion just south of the 212. So as of right now, no, but it's very likely that we will expand to the rest of these three states, probably sooner rather than later. I can't say exactly when, but today, no, but if you are interested, stay tuned.
Okay, and this other one, I don't quite follow the question. Connie, maybe you can clarify this. It says, does big tooth ash and oak in Michigan allowed? I'm assuming you mean big tooth aspen. But I'm not quite sure what the question is getting at. Are you asking if you have oak mixing with aspen? Is that allowed?
Correct. That's correct. Yeah,
Okay.
it's very similar to the question you just asked before
Okay.
this last one. So you answered it.
Okay. Perfect.
Mhm.
Thanks, Connie.
Mhm.
All right, Brittany, I got more for you. Sorry.
Yeah, fire away. No, that's all right. I will say though, Danny did unmute. So, did you have
Oh,
landowners in the room, Danny, that had questions?
Well, thanks for checking. We're good here, Brittany. I just want to point out we've got about 3 minutes left, so
Oh,
maybe has one more question we can let fly, and then we can follow up with folks after too if there were more that we didn't get to, and kind of send the email response for some of those too.
okay. I'll pick one, and if we have time for number two, then so be it. Hopefully we do. One that I think is very important to everybody, and maybe you answered this during the presentation, but what happens in year 21? You mentioned that carbon rights are part of a deed if you sign up for this, but it's also a 20-year contract. So, extreme example here, if in the 21st year after a 20-year contract, somebody wants to come in and level their land and turn it into a Walmart, for example, um, is that allowed, or are there certain rights that are held indefinitely by being part of this program, given the language in a deed? Because that's a pretty serious thing to add something to a deed.
it is. Yes. And no, like 20 years is at the end of 20 years, if a landowner doesn't decide to re-enroll. So they do have the option, and a lot choose to do that. I will say so far that I've noticed the enrolled landowners, very many of them choose for the re-enrollment clause, where at the end of 20 years, we pick them up again for another 20. So that would then be 40 for that carbon right. But no, I mean, technically, I'd like to think that wouldn't happen. The types of landowners that enroll with us, right? Like the sort of behavior change we're incentivizing, the education that these landowners receive, I would hope that wouldn't be the case. But hard line on paper, technically, they aren't re-enrolling at the end of 20 years. We don't own any rights afterwards. So they would be free to make that choice.
Yeah, and I think most would do good things, but something that could easily happen is maybe they want to cut a little harder after 20 years than what's allowed. So it's
Yeah,
an important question from that perspective too.
it is. Yeah.
Um,
I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks, Josh.
my other one, and we might get canceled out here because we're running out of time, but these oak dominated forests are very susceptible to oak decline, which is in some cases going to decrease the merchantable volume basal area rather by more than 25% on their own accord. Does that make you ineligible? Let's say you're eligible when you enroll, but then oak decline causes a drastic decrease in basal area and it's not due to timber harvesting. Do you guys reevaluate and take people out of the program, even though it wasn't an act of a human?
Yep. So what we call that in our clause of our contract is called force majeure. So there we might do what's called a partial termination, but not a full termination, and the landowner's not paying any penalties. Anything like that, forest health, acts of God, if you will, that aren't on purpose, things we can't control, landowners are never penalized for those. So what we might do in this example is if there are areas where the basal area reduction was greater than what we would allow for, we might go out and redraw the boundaries of the contract, reissue, say this happens in like year 6, 7, we would issue a new contract at that time for the remainder of the 20 years, discounting future payments for the footprint of what we cut out, but no penalties would be incurred for the landowner in that example.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. You did a really nice job. Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I really appreciate everybody's attention. Thank you so much for calling in, and please visit our website if you think this would be a good fit for you.
Yeah, thanks again, Brittany, for presenting, giving a great overview of your program. We're trying to kind of bring new or maybe unfamiliar things out there for some of our landowners to try to get an idea of what might be out there, or even what questions to start asking and where to look. So, and just to give folks an example, not to bash on Brittany, we think she's great, and her program, but they're not the only ones out there either. So if you're thinking about this for your land, make sure you do ask all these questions and do the research. So, for example, I think there's another one called Forest Carbon Works or something like that. And Brittany mentioned one that is phased out now, I think was NCX. Was that right, Brittany?
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So think about what your goals are for your land, and what is there and what you want to be there long term, and just make sure to do the research and ask questions like things that Brittany brought up today, to make sure it's a good fit for your land in the long term. So So thanks again, Brittany. Really appreciate your time and hope you have a great afternoon. And thanks everyone for joining us. We are continuing these for a couple months. So if you want to stay tuned and see what other events we have coming up for the Conservation District, just check out our website, or you could join our newsletter there for Mason Lake Conservation District and get the updates on all the great upcoming things. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.
Thanks. Appreciate everyone. Thank you.